Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first ever webinar done by the Freedom Association. I hope it's not the last one. I don't think it will be. I'm delighted to be your new chairman of the Freedom Association. Obviously, with lockdown, etc., we've not been our usual selves or with our usual activities. We are going to do various webinars as we are doing today. You've got an excellent panel here speaking to you, and we'll do some others and follow this up. I was just going to say Happy Independence Day. 4 years ago today, I was in Manchester Town Hall, or City Hall, for the count, and it wasn't amazing to see those screens say outvote wins. It was quite incredible, and the press all turned on us and the cameras and everything, and it was a bit of a, we thought, well, what do we do now? You know, we better sort of jump up and down and make some gestures. But it was an amazing night. And a year ago today, I was actually in a Spitfire to celebrate Independence Day. A bit of delay, thanks to the EU. But flew over the White Cliffs of Dover and Chartwell. Thumbs up to Churchill, who would be on our side, no doubt. But that was an amazing experience. No air hostesses, unfortunately, but it was pretty tight in the cockpit, but quite an experience. So that's my Independence Day tale. And I should say, obviously today you've been following events of the Prime Minister, but it's quite ironic that he's using our Independence Day, 23rd of June, to announce the end of lockdown effectively on the 4th of July, the US Independence Day. So there's an awful lot of Independence Days going on. Which we should be celebrating, and we should of course be celebrating Simon Richards, stepping down as director at the end of June. Has done a wonderful job, but it's his birthday today. I don't know if that's why they chose 23rd of June, but it's actually his birthday. So hi Mark, Mark Wallace has just joined us. So I'm just going to say a bit of housekeeping before we start formally. This is not like Zoom. You're probably well familiar with Zoom. But you won't appear on camera. So if you want to participate, use the bottom button on your screen, the Q&A. Chat isn't working, but use the Q&A and just type in questions. And we can either type them back and answers back, but probably we'll just take them verbally. And we'll do that. So I suggest you probably hold back until everyone's had a little introduction. Otherwise, you know, it'll be at the bottom of the list. If you want to prioritize the question, there is another button, which is a thumbs up button. So just tap on that and the question goes up in priority. So that's the way it kind of works. You know, give us your name if you can as well in those questions, just because sometimes it can be hard to sort of monitor it. We're just going to start with the panelists speaking briefly, and then we'll get into the questions, and we'll try and wrap up around 8. You know, we might be able to go slightly over, but not too much because everyone's got other things they have to do. So essentially today we are celebrating, commemorating the role of Better Off Out, which the Freedom Association put together many years ago, actually. The date was the 26th of April, 2006, 14 years ago. But it played an enormous part in achieving Brexit. And, you know, thanks to you as members, this is a members-only event, for your tremendous support and financing of that. And I can say, you know, I chair the contact group for Vote Leave of all the Eurosceptic organisations and campaigns at the end of the day. And the Freedom Association was one of the first, one of the most enthusiastic. There's Rory there, Rory Broomfield and Simon Richards and others. And it was very, very important that you first out the stocks. You know, you're running way ahead of others, and it was very, very important. So with that introduction, I might just ask, I don't know, actually Mark's now joined us. I don't know if you want to just say you were the campaign manager when the Better Off Out was launched. I'll ask you to speak first if that's all right, just to set the scene. But before I do so, just so people know who we've got, obviously David Nuttall, MP, Bury North, did a brilliant job on the getting the referendum bill, the amendment of the referendum bill, with 83 Conservative MPs defying a three-line whip. That was, you know, so 81, and was a chairman of Better Off Out group of MPs and peers. Philip Davis, you'll know well, MP for Shipley. I'm speaking for York today, actually. I'm locked down in York. You know, Philip, we really a huge sense of gratitude for actually being there at the early days. He'd only just been elected in 2005, and he helped set up Better Off Out right at the core of it, with Christopher Gill, the then chairman, MP, and Mark Wallace and Simon Richards. And he still serves with us on the management committee of the Freedom Association. So great to have Philip here joining us. Rory, well, you'll know he was 2012, 2018. He ran the Better Off Out campaign, did some great campaign work for us, and I'm most grateful for him. He's now at the Commonwealth Research Centre, which has great opportunities. But I'll start with Mark, campaign manager of the Freedom Association at the time Better Off Out was actually formed, and then was campaigner director of the Taxpayers Alliance. We did some great work on keeping us the taxes down. And he's chief executive of Conservative Home, which is a very important role, and does some great work. So do you want to start, Mark, just give us some basic introduction of the campaign of Better Off Out, and then we'll go to our parliamentarians.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to take part, David. There's, you know, and also actually to all those tuned in, Happy Independence Day. You know, this is another time, although it doesn't always feel like happy times at the moment, but it's an amazing thing to celebrate. I'm still pinching myself, quite frankly. To set the scene for what happened, I started working for the Freedom Association, I believe in September of 2005. And around that time, there was this new MP. He seemed like he might be a bit of a troublemaker, potentially. You can't guess who I'm talking about, who was, it turned out, up for sticking his neck out at the Tory conference. And it was Philip Davis, of course, who recognised that this was an opportunity. The fact that there was this hiatus, this gap in leadership. Once the Conservative Party had forced off Michael Howard's attempt to take away from Tory members the actual vote on the Tory leadership, there was this proper contested campaign happening between David Cameron and, I always said Philip Davis, David Davis, if only. And he realised that, of course, this meant that there was a party and there was a structure and there were whips, but there was no actual leadership setting a line on these things. And there was some wriggle room in there to start to set a bit of a precedent. And this was, it was Philip's initiative in many ways to take that chance himself. And it was the Freedom Association that he worked with to provide that platform. He did so at that Tory conference in Blackpool. I can remember it well, in a basement room, in a pub with a slightly suspect carpet, and obviously a slightly less suspect audience. And this, it's often forgotten, was before Better Off Out came into being. Better Off Out as a campaign didn't exist at that point. But what had happened at that conference in 2005 was that this great taboo had that very first crack knocked into it. When I first started working for the Freedom Association, to be quite honest, I met an awful lot of people in and around Westminster, some of whom will now tell you, some of whom are parliamentarians now, who will tell you, oh, I was always there from the early days, fighting to be free and so on, who said to me dozens and dozens of times, a conversation that went something like this: listen, it's dreadfully nice that you've managed to get yourself this little job in politics, but the things you're talking about, like leaving the EU, are so insane, and the people you're talking about with them are so insane, that not only will it never happen, but you'll never get another job in Westminster again as a result. So enjoy it while it lasts. And it might, you know, we can see right now, we've seen them all too vividly in the last few years, how the Remain establishment have reacted to the prospect of simply not getting their way for the first time in their lives. That's after 17 million people are on board. back then, with only one member of parliament speaking out on this topic, you can imagine quite, the word taboo really carried some weight. It was a genuine taboo. You could be, a lot of MPs were expecting that you'd be thrown out of the Conservative Party and would lose the whip for saying something like this. So once that crack was knocked in the wall, the question for us in that winter, towards the end of 2005, early 2006, was what to do next, how to try and build on this. And Philip and various of his colleagues were very supportive and very clear and very adamant that actually there was much further to go in this. Actually, once you demonstrated that it was possible to say something that everyone thought was against the rules and prove that the sky didn't fall on your head, and actually maybe there'll be quite a lot of voters out there who agree with you, that other people would be willing to follow suit. And so that helped to set the tone. I remember meeting with Christopher Gill, I think in January of 2006, in a pub in the deepest Shropshire, which I presented to him the campaign plan that I worked on with him, with Simon Richards, and talking to Philip and others, in which we said, well, this isn't just about the EU is bad. This is about setting out that path for other politicians to do this, and other people, other institutions, eventually the majority of voters, to accept and acknowledge that actually it's not just a kind of something you can get away with saying you should leave the EU. It's a desirable thing, it's a positive thing. And really it was from that the Better Off Out campaign was moulded. That's why from the very first, this wasn't just a campaign saying Brussels is crap, the EU does things badly, woe is me. All those things are true, obviously, in many ways. But actually saying there is an alternative, and leaving it's not just that EU membership is a bad deal for our country, but that independence, self-determining democracy, and self-governance is actively, positively better. There's a whole world of opportunity out there, and that's really how those two kind of factors came together to mould that campaign in its very early days. But I'm going to say huge credit to all of our colleagues at the Freedom Association at that time, but particularly to Philip, because he was there helping enormously to actually have these conversations with other parliamentarians and people around Westminster to say, well, hang on a second, isn't it about time we stopped kind of nodding? You stopped nodding and saying, oh, I agree with you, but don't tell anybody, and started saying to voters, I agree with him, and I'd like to tell you all. And that's really how the genesis of the campaign came to be.
Thanks, Mark. There's an introduction. It just shows you how dangerous it was in those days. I'm well aware of that, especially sitting in the European Parliament. You're not Mr. Popular, I can tell you that. Do you want to take that on and just, tell us a bit more about that start and your impressions?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with such great titans of the Brexit campaign. I said in my maiden speech, when I got elected in 2005, I said in my maiden speech that I want a country that has a sovereign parliament, not one run by a corrupt and inefficient institution called the European Union, which we subsidise to the tune of billions of pounds a year. Yeah. And I got into terrible trouble a few weeks in as being an MP. I actually made an intervention in a debate on Europe where I'd indicated that I would be in favour of leaving the EU altogether. And within minutes, I got a pager message from David McLean, who was the chief whip. Yeah. This is while Michael Howard was leader. And obviously it's quite ironic because both Michael Howard and David McLean were both keen supporters of Brexit in the referendum. But at the time, David McLean gave me a dressing down for saying this, and actually insisted I sign a statement of withdrawal of what I'd said, and that I actually supported the party's policy on Europe. Right. And I said to David McLean that I would be prepared to sign this statement on saying I supported the party's view on Europe if Ken Clarke would sign it too. And obviously there was no chance of that ever happening. So I was sort of in the clear with the chief whip, but he clearly wasn't very happy. And actually, it was Mark and Simon who suggested I spoke at the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool that autumn. Would I speak on why we should leave the EU? Which, I mean, obviously it seems an obvious thing now, but back then nobody would actually say that. I mean, lots of MPs, even those on the sort of who were heroes of the cause, back then they would say we want to get powers back. and things like this, but they never actually openly say the words, we should leave the European Union. And so I made this speech because Mark and Simon had asked me to in Blackpool, which got quite a bit of newspaper coverage, actually, the fact that somebody had actually said, and it was partly because it was, it was either partly because they thought I was mad or partly in sadness or whatever. Anyway, they reported that I'd sort of become the first MP to openly say we should leave the European Union. And we set up, with Mark and Simon's organisation, we set up the Better Off Out campaign in April, as you said, David, at the start, April 2006. I got into terrible trouble because it was in the middle of the local election campaign, and all these Conservatives said it was a terrible time to launch it. And of course, whatever date it would have been launched, it would no doubt have been a terrible time to launch it. But we launched it in a committee room and invited the media and other MPs along. And I can say, in all honesty, I expected to be the only MP there. I thought that there were, that I would literally be the only person there, but we had to start somewhere. And Better Off Out as a name was very important because I always felt that, everyone knew that the EU was undemocratic and we'd lost sovereignty and whatever. But I always felt that to leave the EU, we'd have to win the economic argument as to why we would be economically and financially better off out of the EU. So it was the name was very, very important. So we had the launch in a committee room, and to my absolute shock, a number of other MPs turned up to the launch, and they were, just to give them a bit of a name check as to the other MPs that turned up to the first meeting, they were Sir Nicholas Winterton, Anne Winterton, Philip Hollowbone, Douglas Carswell, who was a Conservative MP at the time, newly elected as I was, David T.C. Davis, Bob Spink, who was the MP for Castlepoint at the time and actually had the whip taken off him for other reasons at a later date, Christopher Chope, and the much missed Eric Forth, who was my mentor and best friend in Parliament. And actually, very sadly, the Better Off Out meeting was the last day I saw Eric Forth alive. He died very, very soon afterwards. But I was amazed that these MPs had turned up to the launch of Better Off Out. I was absolutely staggered that so many of my colleagues had come and were prepared to put their heads above the parapet as well. And not long afterwards, as Mark will recall, most of the DUP MPs signed up to the Better Off Out campaign as well. So literally from a standing start, we've got about 17 MPs signed up to Better Off Out in no time at all. And to be frank, David, we were up and running. And I remember doing an interview on the radio the day after the launch. I don't know if it was the Today programme or Radio 5 Live. It was one or the other, the day afterwards, where we discussed the launch of Better Off Out on the radio. And I kept getting invited to places like the Daily Politics show and places like that to talk about leaving the EU. And the great thing really about it was that, our opponents would engage in the debate about, even through by saying it was mad and crackers and it was ridiculous and ludicrous and all the rest of it. Yeah. But simply by engaging in the debate, they made this a legitimate debate to have in polite circles. All of a sudden, it became it was a reasonable position to hold. It was a genuine debate. It was something that it was in the political mainstream all of a sudden that people in Parliament were actually having this debate about whether we should be in or out of the European Union. So, I mean, when you look back on as our 4th anniversary of leaving the EU, the role I played barely warrants a mention, to be perfectly honest. And other people made a much bigger impact in the fact that we actually left. People like the Prime Minister that we've got now and Nigel Farage in particular have a much bigger impact on us actually leaving the EU. But I think the Freedom Association and the Better Off Out campaign, and Mark and Simon in particular, who had the foresight to see that this is where the Freedom Association should be going, they deserve an awful lot of credit and not more than a mere footnote when all of the histories come to be written, because they played that key role in making this a mainstream debate to be had in political circles. And that took us forward an awful long way.
No, thanks so much, Philip. That's excellent. And yeah, what a result that was, getting all those MPs along. I think you're absolutely right about the name Better Off Out, because I always felt, you know, I use the phrase positive vision. You know, we have to actually paint a picture of life outside the EU that is positive and uplifting. And you can see the challenge we have even today about, you know, the benefits of free trade agreements or cutting red tape. But the name was wonderful, I think, and it was very well chosen and carried a lot of weight. I just turn now to David Nuttall. David, you took on the chairmanship of the Better Off Out later on. Just wonder if you want to say a bit more about the work it did and how it panned out, especially with the referendum bill.
Yeah, well, thank you, David, and it's great to be on this panel this evening and to be able to just look back at those days. And I think what is interesting to start with is that Euroscepticism back in the day, I think Mark touched on this, was more about seen by people as something that we wanted to stop any more powers. They wanted to stop any more powers going, but the idea of getting powers back or even leaving altogether was something that most people thought would never, ever happen. Mm. I first fought a campaign in '97, and my business partner at the time fought for the referendum party under Goldsmith. And I'd always been dubious about the nature of the benefits. I had great misgivings that there were any real benefits in us being members of the European Union. And this was reinforced to me when I was a member of the Yorkshire and Humber team of candidates in the '99 European elections. It became ever more obvious to me that it was going to fall apart eventually, and that the more we went into it, the more disastrous it was for our sovereignty. But by the time I was elected in 2010, the first thing that I was pretty much signed up to the Better Off Out agenda, because it was clear to me that there was no way that our membership could ever be reformed in a meaningful way. The EU simply wouldn't allow it. And the only real sensible option was for us to leave entirely and become an independent sovereign nation once again. And at the time, some of you may remember that the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, one of the things that he said was that he wanted to stop the Conservative Party banging on about Europe all the time. It did seem to me that it was all very well talking about all the other interesting things that were being discussed at the time, like hugging huskies at the North Pole and all these other interesting ideas that were being knocked about in politics. But whilst ever we were members of the European Union, and whilst ever our laws were a large part of our laws were being dictated by Brussels, these other matters were insignificant. What really mattered was regaining a complete independence of our affairs. This was before I became chairman of the Better Off Out group. I was attending the meetings under Philip at the time. And in the summer and early autumn of 2011, I, along with other members of the Better Off Out group, hatched a plan to try and have a debate in Parliament about holding a referendum on us actually leaving the European Union, because it was clear that we'd gone in on a referendum, and in reality, the only way that we would leave is if there was a referendum where a majority of the British people voted to leave. immediately I got to Parliament, I was part of I was a member of the Procedure Committee. And so I soon realised that having a working knowledge of the procedures of the House was a good way to learn how to make progress in the House of Commons. And we were helped at the time in our endeavours by the fact that a backbench business committee had been formed, which had time allocated to it. And one of the things that is most precious in the House of Commons is time and the ability to decide what is done with that time. Historically, that has mainly fallen to the government. The government decides what is debated and when it's debated. But now, for the first time, a group of backbenchers were able to determine which subjects were debated and when. Well, not necessarily when, as I might mention later on, but they were given dates on which they could decide the subject. And it so happened that we were very fortunate in the Better Off Out camp that Philip was a member of the Backbench Business Committee, as was Peter Bone, as was Philip Hollowbone. And so we had a good start. The chairman of the committee at the time was Natasha Engel, who went on to become a deputy speaker, of course. And I decided that what we would do is jump through all the necessary hoops to apply to the committee for a debate, a whole day debate, a full day's debate on the issue of leaving the European, of holding a referendum in order to leave the European Union. And having failed on the first attempt and gone back and dealt with all the requirements of the committee, eventually it was listed for debate. And obviously, we'll never know what went on behind the scenes, but you can imagine that there was a fair deal of consternation in government circles about the fact that this hot topic, this controversial topic, I should say, rather than hot topic, had reached was going to reach the floor of the House of Commons. And for the first time, the matter was to be given a proper airing. And it engendered, as I well know, an enormous amount of publicity. And, all the papers were talking about it. It dominated the news agenda for the time that the debate was on. And it was actually moved. Normally, backbench business was held on a Thursday. But unusually, the government moved it to a Monday because they wanted to make sure that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary at the time, who was William Hague, were there in the Commons to rally the troops against this, as they saw it, ridiculous idea. But it soon became obvious. We did a fair bit of, I won't say a whipping operation, but some might call it that. But we did what we could to, as you would, to try and encourage people to support the motion that we had put down. And as you mentioned in the introduction, David, in the end, 81 Conservative MPs were prepared to defy the three-line whip that was imposed on all Conservative MPs to vote against the idea of having a referendum on which there would be an out option. I think the total number of MPs who voted against, in favour of the motion, were about 111, because there were some Labour MPs, and the entirety of the DUP voted with the motion. So that was a big stepping stone, really. And again, as Philip mentioned, it was part of the general move of the Better Off Out idea becoming mainstream. Because once it was started to be discussed in the House of Commons, and MPs from the Better Off Out group kept asking questions about it, and generally making it clear that our votes couldn't be relied on European business, it became more and more a position in Parliament which was gaining credence, and it became a more respectable position to hold. When I took over from Philip as chairman of Better Off Out, we held regular meetings in the Commons and had MPs there, members of the House of Lords who were supportive. Of course, UKIP, although when we started didn't have any MPs, they had members in the House of Lords, Lord Pearson, for example.
Yeah.
And we also had representatives, as well as from the TFA and the Better Off Out organisation, from organisations like Get Britain Out, Campaign for an Independent Britain. And it was very much a case of ensuring that we were all singing from the same hymn sheet, making sure that we all knew what everyone else was doing, and generally making sure that the flame of genuine Euroscepticism, the Euroscepticism that didn't just mean the idea of trying to recoup one or two powers, but actually leaving the European Union, was kept alive. And it you know, when I look back, I think, you know, we used to talk amongst ourselves about how it would go about, and it, of course, as viewers will know, the next big thing that happened on the road to the referendum being held was David Cameron's Bloomberg speech, when he announced that if the Conservatives won the next election, scheduled for 2015, there would actually be a referendum on our membership of the European Union, not as it was then, but in a renegotiated form, because his plan was to go away, as he subsequently did, and renegotiate our terms of membership. So you know, that's where we managed to progress it to, and there was another APPG formed under John Barron, an all-party group for holding a referendum, which again added to the pressure within Parliament, and obviously there was the ongoing influence and effect of UKIP as well. So I entirely agree with what Mark and Philip said. I think what Better Off Out did was to roll the pitch for what was to come and make it acceptable for politicians who were perhaps more household names than the likes of myself to become associated with the Better Off Out cause.
Thanks very much, David. I do think that vote was really critical. You know, I think it sent shockwaves through the Conservative leadership that they couldn't actually ignore the issue. And of course, it became stated policy, the referendum policy later. I should just add perhaps that, you know, Freedom Association is pretty much 50-50 Conservative Party and UKIP stroke Brexit Party. And I've been fortunate enough to be in both, actually. And, you know, I'm very proud of the role that UKIP played, and Nigel Farage, you know, I've seen it with a one-man opposition to European Parliament, hugely brave, surrounded by presidents wherever you look. And he does deserve enormous praise for the courage he showed and the belief and leadership. So it was sort of a united effort in many ways, but I do think the Conservative Party's referendum pledge was essential and was a game changer, and complacency came in from Cameron and co that they thought they could win that referendum. As we know, 4 years ago today, they didn't. So that's great. I don't know, Rory, do you want to just say a little bit, and then we'll get straight into questions because time's pressing on. So, Rory.
Sure, David, absolutely. I'll just, firstly, before I do, if I could say thank you for the invitation to be on here with all these champions of freedom, and also mention Simon Richards and his role with this, because the role that Simon played was, I think, emblematic for Better Off Out, in that it wasn't just a positive message, it was delivered by such a nice guy, and someone that you could really relate to and engage with. That he developed, I would like to say myself included, but beyond the Freedom Association, was a real key to, I think, its and Better Off Out's success, in the sense that we coordinated with, as David mentioned, a number of groups. We tried to help others when they needed help, including in the referendum, when even we reached out to Labour Leave and helped their particular cause. It was all about the cause, and the ability to relate, to the ability to coordinate through the Better Off Out All Parliamentary Group and others was invaluable to the campaign's ultimate success, I believe. And certainly when, if you recall, in the stages developing towards the actual campaign, where Vote Leave were formed, along with Leave.eu and Grassroots Out, the Freedom Association and the Better Off Out campaign would work with all of them. We, as I recall, the organisation did not take a corporate stance to back one or t'other. And as a result, we were not just independent brokers, as the Better Off Out campaign and the Freedom Association more generally, we were seen as authentic in the sense that there was no other axe to grind. We were fully committed to it. And again, actually, to say that fully committed to it, a huge shout out, if I may, to the membership who have been incredibly supportive of Better Off Out and the Freedom Association more generally throughout my association with TFA, joining as a member prior to 2012 and joining as an employee from there into 2018. And so just to re-emphasize that the focus and the emphasis on positivity and, in a way, inclusiveness to the cause, I think were really key attributes for TFA and Better Off Out, making not just headwind in the referendum campaign, and goodness knows, I think we spoke at over 100 debates across the country, always getting the swing, interestingly enough. We never always won, but every single debate there was a swing, and I think that is emblematic to, I think, the issue of the day and what people felt about it, evidently at the ballot box on the 23rd of June 4 years ago. And so that's what I'd just like to say, that credit to the TFA and members and the associated individuals and entities with it, because without the wider efforts, without the inclusiveness of the mini platoons that fought the battle along the way, I don't think we would have had such a good result on this day 4 years ago than we did.
Thanks very much, Rory. That's great. I should mention that Lord Stoddart, of course, was a wonderful representative, a wonderful man, a great speaker, and how essential it was that we had the Labour side. You mentioned Labour Leave, but at the end of the day, the red wall that we now have under Boris, you know, that vote was absolutely critical. And, you know, the whole areas of Britain, like the northeast, which are not, you couldn't find many Tories there, voted very strongly, like Sunderland, on the night for Brexit. And that was tremendously important. So, you know, all credit to the Labour side, even braver in many ways on the Labour side than on the right. We're going to take some questions now. If I may, just because it follows from the conversation, we've got our old friend Graham from the Bruges Group, Graham Eardley, just asking about how important the Bruges Group was to the Euro realist stance in 2005 onwards. I don't know who would like to take that. Philip, is that something you'd want to comment on, the Bruges Group?
Yes, the Bruges Group were very, very important. And, you know, Barry Legg is a great, great man, absolute great man. And, you know, again, a very articulate proponent of the cause. And I mean, I've spoken at a number of Bruges Group's events that they organised on this particular subject. And again, they were very, very good at bringing together Conservative and UKIP at the time and Brexit Party people to make sure that we were all fighting the same cause. We weren't bogged down with sort of issues of purity and things like this. There were a number of groups involved at the time. But yes, Barry Legg and the Bruges Group did a fantastic amount of work of bringing people together. And David mentioned earlier about the Better Off Out meetings, and the Bruges Group were one of those groups that regularly attended our parliamentary Better Off Out meetings, and very welcome they were too. And like I say, Barry and the Bruges Group did a brilliant tob.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd second that. If I could leap in on that topic, actually, one of the things, again, you used to hear quite a lot around this time, and even right the way up to the referendum itself, was, well, why don't you all just get together and be one big organisation? And what I always used to say at the time was that actually it's much better to first, you've got to recognise the world as it is, rather than say how you want it to be. Eurosceptics don't always agree about everything. Secondly, one reason why we were anti-EU is we wanted the right to spend the rest of our lives disagreeing with each other about how our country ought to be run. But it would be our decision that we decide together. And thirdly, different groups were good at different things. And the Bruges Group obviously had that fantastic heritage as an organisation, really having recognised many of these problems far earlier than many other people did, and be bold enough to speak out about them. One of the great strengths of Better Off Out, as Rory was saying, is that the Freedom Association only wanted to win this battle. It wasn't interested in demanding that to join Better Off Out you had to be a TFA member or you had to agree with this or anything else. And that meant that I went off to the Campaign for Independent Britain committee meetings with Lord Stoddart. We worked with John Mills and Labour Euro Safeguards. We worked with people in UKIP and the Conservatives. And it didn't matter where you were from, or even whether you were willing to join up with us or do anything about it, beyond the fact you're willing to say it and you're willing to take part in that. And that, I think, the fact is the Freedom Association was willing to rise above, and the support and help of organisations like the Bruges Group was undoubtedly really important in that, and a huge credit to them.
Thank you for that. There's a question now from Owen, I think I'm saying it right, Owen, who's asking if the option of a referendum was completely dismissed by the Conservatives, would there have been any other possible avenue of leaving the EU other than a referendum? Interesting question. David,
Well, I come in on that briefly, David. It seemed to us when we discussed this at the time that the only other way that a government would have a mandate would, if it had included that as a manifesto pledge and been elected with that as a central plank of its manifesto. And obviously, in theory, if UKIP had formed a government, that would have happened. But the reality was that wasn't going to happen. And that the most likely way that we would leave would be to have a government which would at least pledge to hold a referendum, which of course is the way that it happened in the end. It would have been possible. Of course it would have been possible, but the reality was that we needed a referendum. A referendum didn't take us in, but a referendum endorsed our entry in '75. And it was pretty clear to us that other than having a party win a general election with a manifesto pledge, a referendum really was the only option.
Yes, I should comment on that. I suppose I was deputy leader of UKIP, and the cruel thing for UKIP and all small parties, you do feel for smaller parties, you get crushed often in general elections, the first past the post. You had UKIP, in 2004 doing incredibly well, and with proportional representation, and then going down to 2 or 3% in the general election. Of course, the challenge was, well, how on earth do you get this policy through? And it's a cruel world, but I think the pressure And again, Nigel Farage deserves a lot of credit. But really, he put a lot of pressure on the Conservative Party to do the right thing. And you had people like Stuart Wheeler, who gave millions to the Conservative Party, ending up backing UKIP and many others. And really, we were, when I was involved with UKIP, it's a pressure party, which is quite an unusual animal. It's not really a pressure group, and it's not a full political party. It didn't have a full slate of policies. We did try and do that. But that was a cruel reality of first past the post. You're not really going to break through. So I think the referendum really was the only way, and that's why I came back to Conservatives and supported it, because I felt that was the only way we were going to get out of the EU, and we did 4 years ago, finally.
Yeah, I think the questioner's scenario happened. The Conservative Party did rule out holding a referendum on leaving the EU, and it kept on doing it until UKIP punched so many holes in the Conservative Party that David Cameron realised he had to. So I think the only other alternative way to leave the EU, other than by winning a referendum, was the way that I was very, very concerned about, which was the eventual collapse of the European Union, with us inside it. And that would have been far more costly and far more damaging. It would have taken far longer, and we would have had to spend trillions and trillions of more pounds than we'd already spent on EU membership trying to stave it off. So, I think a referendum is always going to be the way it had to happen. It was also, frankly, the quickest way. That was the shortcut, because it gave you the chance to bypass people having to put their faith in politicians, with all due respect to the politicians on the panel, to do it themselves. They didn't have to vote for a particular candidate. You didn't have to buy into a party or abandon your party allegiance. You just had to vote leave, and people did it.
Yeah. If I would just mention the sense that the change in atmosphere, I would say, after the Bloomberg announcement from Cameron was palpable, because that meant that there was a focus, and it was in a way outside the government's control, although I'm sure Philip and David could weigh in on that in terms of especially concerning Project Fear. But with regards to the actual manifesto pledges and the like, it wasn't as clear that the government had as much control. And although it was put directly into the manifesto, and of course the general election came about in 2015, it really did hold the government. So, of whatever colour, it would have held the government to account, and they needed to have delivered that referendum, and they duly did.
It's worth saying on the referendum, I asked Linton Crosby, I know a bit, about how important that referendum pledge was. And he said that basically it firmed up the vote around the edges. I think what you got then in 2015 was a surprise Conservative win, with, a slim majority, but enough to get the referendum through. I think it was very important, knowing, how people think, like from the UKIP side I was involved with. I do think the referendum pledge was very important to maybe 5%, maybe 10%, and actually got us into power. I got the Conservatives into power and then got the referendum delivered. But there was still this sort of attitude that, it was pretty obvious it was going to be 60-40 to remain, as happened under Harold Wilson. Just turning to a more modern question or update question, if I may, we've got one here from Timothy Scott about the transition period. On what basis do you think we'll exit? Deal or no deal? What kind of deal? Interested in what the panel thinks will happen, not what we'd like to happen. What do we say to that? Who'd like to go first on that? Philip, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing's clear, and that's that we're going to be leaving at the end of December this year. I think people have been worried that there's going to be an extension to the implementation period. I don't think there's any prospect of that happening at all. I think the Prime Minister has been absolutely robust and clear. I mean, if you remember, the Prime Minister put it into law, but we left at the, and that was it. So it wasn't just we want to. It's the law of the land, and to change that, the government's going to have to change the law, and that isn't going to happen. So we're going to leave at the end of December. With what kind of deal or not? I don't know, is the honest answer to that question. I don't know. I mean, I think our chief negotiator, David Frost, is absolutely brilliant, to be perfectly honest. I mean, absolutely different class to the negotiation we had under Theresa May. I mean, if only David Frost had been there from the word go, then, you know, and he's been, I think he's been a breath of fresh air leading those negotiations. So I think it's perfectly clear that the government has absolutely no intention of doing any kind of deal that leaves us shackled to the EU still, that it will be you know, we want free trade. You know, I'm a free trader. I believe in free trade. I want zero tariffs with the EU, just as I want free trade with other parts of the world. And I'm in the happy position, it seems, of that the government is where I am, which hasn't always been the case over the last 15 years.
Of course,
so I think, you know, all I can say is I think we will certainly leave at the end of December, and I believe we will leave whatever we do, whether it's with a deal or without a deal. I believe that we will be leaving in a way that means that we're no longer shackled to the European Union in any shape or form.
Mark, do you want to comment on that or not?
I'm broadly of a similar kind of mind to Philip's. You know, some of these, as we saw last year, the most important thing to getting some kind of agreement is being willing to leave without one. You know, the number of times all of us here, and no doubt all of the listeners at home, banged their heads against the brick wall of Theresa May trying to explain that before. David Frost gets that, Boris Johnson gets that, Dominic Cummings gets that. I wouldn't be too surprised if we were to end up with quite a fragmentary deal, if you see what I mean. People often talk about this stuff as if it's one big deal or nothing. The fact is, it is, you know, if they're up against that deadline, and there are some things that both sides simply can't agree on, they can just sidestep them. They can leave some things and say, no, we'll agree about those later, but let's have a deal that agrees the stuff we can agree and move on that basis. The fact is, it's all a work in progress anyway. That's the wonderful thing about democracy.
Right. If I may, we've got a few coming in now. If I may just take this one. What about Jimmy Goldsmith's place in history with the referendum party? And probably linked to that, are there any other countries likely to leave the EU? What is the future of the euro is also from another attendee. So maybe all of those issues, referendum party, euro, anyone else leaving?
Well, I mean, yeah, James Goldsmith deserves an awful lot of credit, and of course his son Zach is a great man and fought valiantly for leave, even though it ultimately cost him his seat in Parliament, I suspect. I mean, you know, so the Goldsmith family have an awful lot to be proud of in terms of their role in leaving, and you know, and there's lots of people who, you know, I think that should be remembered as part of this. Paul Sykes is somebody who I think should be particularly, you know, he'd been at this for years and years and years, and I rang him up on the day that we left to thank him for everything he'd done, and just said the only piece of advice I can give you, Paul, is not to work out how much you've spent in order to get here, because I mean, and I think, you know, I always think people like James Goldsmith, Aaron Banks, Paul Sykes, these people, they didn't need to spend millions of pounds of their own money for their own benefit. These people were they were going to live a life of luxury, whether we stayed in the EU or not, and they were prepared to put their heads above the parapet, spend absolute eye-watering sums of money, get themselves a hell of a lot of grief in the meantime, simply to do what they thought was right for the country. And I think all of those people deserve an enormous amount of credit for basically for doing that, because without their funds, you know, UKIP wouldn't have been as successful as they were, and the whole campaign to leave wouldn't have been as successful as it was. And so I think there's an awful lot of people, but yes, James Goldsmith is certainly in that category of people. As for other countries leaving, look, I know there are some people, and I'm sure there's many people on this call here who crave the full destruction of the European Union. And their life won't be settled until that's happened. But I never took that view. I'm quite happy for the European Union to be successful if it wishes to be. All I wanted us was to be out of it. And what other countries do is entirely a matter for them. And if they can quite happily live within a European Union and they're happy to do that, then good luck to them, I say. I don't crave the destruction of the European Union. All I ever craved was us not being a member of it.
Yeah. It's worth saying, I mean, Paul Sykes, I went to his operation when I was with UKIP, and he did some wonderful posters, but there's another example of he was backing the Conservatives originally, but on this issue, as you say, he did a fantastic job and made a real difference. And Aaron Banks, I know when it came to the referendum, he spent an awful lot of money right up front, which really got the campaign going. And I think we should be very indebted to his contribution. You know, I saw it firsthand. Sorry, there's a few others just coming up on various topics. I think we should say hi to the Exeter University Freedom Society, William Yarwood. I have spoken there. It's a great place down in Exeter. Recent history. Do any of you think that the Brexit Party and Farage has a future? Or do you think now Brexit essentially been solved, they'll become irrelevant? Who wants to? David, do you want to?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because essentially, their entire reason for being in existence will come to an end on the 31st of December this year. If one could argue it came to an end on the was it the 30th, the 29th of January. But certainly on the 31st of December, as Philip said, you know, it looks very, very, very likely now that that's when we will leave, and that the transition agreement will come to an end, I should say. So my view, pretty much as Philip's view as far as the rest of the EU members are concerned, is that if they want to continue, let Nigel and his friends continue with the party, but they're going to have to come up with some sort of platform of policies. And as you mentioned, David, it is very, very difficult in a first-past-the-post system for any minor party to break through. And you know, history. One looks at the history books. It's not impossible, obviously, but it is extremely difficult. And so if you're asking for what I think will happen, is I think it will become, it will eventually wind up, and that will, but they can pat themselves on the back that they have achieved what they set out to do. And there aren't many people in politics who can do that, quite frankly. You know, it's a great achievement to set out to do something in politics, do it, and say, right, I've done that. I'll go on and do something else. So there's nothing to be ashamed of, and they should indeed, I think, be proud of the contribution they have made to the cause.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to say anything? Or
very briefly, on the Roll of Honour we were mentioning earlier, I'd also engrave entries for Stuart Wheeler and Nigel Vinson. Both excellent men who fit that description that Philip gave earlier. People who didn't have to do what they did, but they gave a huge amount of themselves as well as what they had for this cause. I think the Brexit Party, Theresa May helped to create the Brexit Party. She gave them Nigel Farage that huge opportunity, as well as the responsibility to come back and to help to save Brexit. The fact is, the question will be what's done with the powers we get back. The Conservative Party or the other parties could indeed make a mess of using the powers we've got control of. And then if it's not Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party or someone similar, these traditional party loyalties are so fractured now by what we've gone through. Main parties made Eurosceptics hammer away at those loyalties just to get our vote honoured. And there's so much of that so fractured now that I think it is easier for insurgent parties to capitalise on the establishment messing up. So, you know, beware, if they mess up again, then somebody will come along to punish them for it.
Okay, just a couple more questions. We've got about another 10 minutes, if that's all right. And I'll just sort of put them all together if I may, or there's one in particular that's slightly different. But I was just wondering, I mean, people are concerned about Northern Ireland, Justin Shusher, still remaining effectively part of the EU customs union. How can we ensure our constitutional integrity, ensure Northern Ireland eventually fully exits the EU sphere of influence? Very good question. I'm a former special advisor Northern Ireland peace process, so very concerned about Northern Ireland. And whether it's sovereign negation, yeah, I think we've covered that one. I'm just looking. Also, has any research been actioned to discover the reasons people voted leave in the referendum? We're told it's mainly a commission issue, but has this been verified? Who wants to go first on that, sort of a couple of those questions?
I very briefly refer that final questioner to Lord Ashcroft's mass opinion polling on why people voted the way they did, including in recent elections as well as in the referendum, which looks at that in great detail, which I've got to say, blowing our own trumpet, bore out a lot of the Freedom Association's analysis of why Better Off Out was a good idea, a good way to talk about these things.
It's worth saying on that research that it clearly says that self-government or sovereignty or whatever you call it comes first and immigration second. To those that say it's all, about, racist or, all these absurd claims are made, it wasn't. It was British people understanding the value of self-government and independence. And that was the primary, it's very clear from that research, that was the primary reason. Anyone else want to comment on that? Rory, anything?
No, actually, David, you took words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was going to add. The Lord Ashcroft is a great, those pollings are great mythbusters. If anyone down the pub, when we're finally able to visit one, is saying, well, this happened or that happened, well, refer back to those, because they prove beyond what I can see is being proved as myths going around in various newspapers, that there were other intentions and positive intentions, as was.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think just there's a couple of sort of related but not directly related questions. One is about NATO and where it leaves us on NATO. The other one is really quite left field or right field, I don't know, but what does the panel think about the BBC requiring that 20% of writers, directors and crew must form a diverse background in order to get future shows commissioned? I'm not sure if that's entirely relevant, but it is a freedom association, so I'll let you answer. Free range, but
well, David, you won't be surprised in the least to guess that I'm not in favour of that, of quotas.
Yeah.
Whether it's set by the BBC or anybody else for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's anyone else want to comment on those issues?
Well, the thing about the BBC is, of course, that it believes in diversity of everything apart from opinion. I mean, actually, I'm still on the DCMS Select Committee, and we had the chief executive of Ofcom before us today, and I did actually ask her whether or not she thought that there was any sort of bias in the BBC or Channel 4 News, and she seemed to think that there wasn't, which was quite extraordinary, really. I mean, I did make the point that it was, if you've got a metropolitan, left-leaning, Remain-dominated, middle-class, politically correct regulator, marking the homework of a left-leaning, Remain-dominated, metropolitan, politically correct broadcaster, then you won't be surprised that they didn't notice there were any issues. So yes, I mean, a bit of diversity of opinion on the BBC would be what I'd like to see, and that's the one thing that they seem determined to avoid.
I do think actually that it's a very important point that they want diversity of everything apart from political diversity. I mean, why we got a situation where academics 80-90% are left leaning? It's very unhealthy, and the BBC I think has lost the plot. I mean, I used to be a great fan of a lot of its content, but I think the fact that Ofcom is so weak that they realise they can get away with it, and it's a major problem, and it's the The partiality that is the major problem, rather than a lot of resources of content. That's another argument. But I think that's something the Freedom Association should work on, political diversity. It is about rebalancing left and right in a fair way. It's not sort of, arguing for special treatment. And that's something I'm keen to do. Rory, do you want to say something?
Just briefly on the BBC side of things, I think it should be recognised the great work that TFA has done on the Axe the TV tax campaign, which Andrew led when I was there, and previously with the Free the Airwaves campaign that Simon Richards championed, and maybe Mark was involved with all those years ago. And there's a real backlog of fantastic research and a wealth of not just experience and input that TFA has had on this. And I noticed, interestingly enough, a number of other campaigns groups have taken up the mantle in the past year or so. And it's to TFA's credit for having created that environment that those groups can come into.
Anyone else want to comment? We've actually.
I think just on that question of our influence within NATO and indeed other global bodies, we always made the point in Parliament that leaving the EU wouldn't result in any lessening of our influence in the world. In many respects, I've always argued that we would have increased influence, because no longer would our views be simply subsumed into those of the EU. We would be seen once more as an independent, sovereign, strong nation, one of the strongest nations on earth. And I have no fears whatsoever that the rest of the world will look upon us any less favourably just because we're not members of the European Union. And I think a lot of states around the world will look upon us and say, well, good on them. The British people had the sense, and they were prepared to take the chance when it was given to them to leave what might be seen as the comfort blanket of the EU and strike it out on their own. And I don't think that there's any difficulty in that situation whatsoever.
I agree strongly with that, and I think we do have a job of work to do in the UK as Eurosceptics, as supporters of NATO, to explain yet again, because some of the other sides still don't get it, what the difference is between something like the EU and something like NATO. You hear this argument still doing the rounds that, oh, well, what about the sovereignty we sacrifice of NATO? There is no sacrifice of sovereignty with NATO. Sovereign country promises with other sovereign countries they'll defend each other. NATO doesn't have a government, it doesn't have an executive, it doesn't legislate or regulate. It doesn't change. It stays with what Parliament and the British government agreed on the UK's behalf in the first place. And we've got to keep making that case. I think we've got to keep arguing that actually NATO should work to give help to protect other countries having the right to be democratically self-determining. I'm glad to see post-Brexit UK standing up for the rights of Hong Kongers, for example. I've got to say, there's got to be some way we can reach out to freedom-loving people in the United States of America to try to ensure that some of the Republicans' current skepticism of NATO is tempered a little bit by reminding them that actually as the free world stands together or it falls apart.
Yeah, can I just say that we've got to wrap up now, but I mean, what I found as an MEP, I mean, the nub of all of it, the problem with the EU, which we didn't have debates about leaving NATO or the World Trade Organization. And the real issue, the difference is that the EU is supranational. It overrides sovereignty, whereas NATO doesn't. You can leave NATO, no problem. Here we are 4 years later. We still haven't left the single market or the customs union. And the World Trade Organization, there is no world government there. It's actually self-governing, national governments within it. I don't know what Mandelson would do with it if he actually got to be head of it, but God forbid. But that is a really core, it might be a nerdy point, but the difference between supranational and governmental is fundamental to all of this. So on that note, if I may just thank all the panelists for coming along for contribution, let you go and eat and look after families or whatever, but thank you for that. And thank you, Harrison, who's on the technical side, and Andrew Allison for putting this together. Obviously, we haven't charged for tonight. This is the members, something as a benefit for members, but we may have a go at charging for webinars in the future. But if you have a chance to donate, there's appeal letters have gone out. We want to reboot the association, the Freedom Association, because, you know, obviously we put a lot into referendum and Brexit. And it's been 4 years down the line, so it's slowed things down a bit, and we need to reboot and get going on other freedom issues like freedom of speech. Very keen to do. So please think of donating and contributing along those lines. Again, thank you so much for coming along. Really appreciated, and again, happy Independence Day. Please go and celebrate. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.